Hi, I'm Daniel Berger. Welcome back to AIM Truthcast. Today we're going to be looking at the 5 errors of psychiatric diagnoses. Welcome back to AIM Truthcast. This is video 2 in our series of the 5 errors of psychiatric diagnoses. If you haven't already seen video 1, I would encourage you to go check out that video before watching this one. We talk about the error of reification, which leads into today's discussion. And now we move on to the error of tautology. And before we go any further, I want to once again remind you that the phenomena that are listed, that are said to be the diagnostic category or label or diagnoses, the disorder concept, the actual phenomena are real. But the label is not helpful to us. Yes, it helps insurance companies. Yes, it helps secular researchers try to find something in the body. But it doesn't provide utility in actually helping you. It doesn't explain you, and it doesn't explain your phenomena. So let's jump right into looking at the error of tautology. Whereas reification is the error of transubstantiation. And by that I simply mean that you take an idea and you transubstantiate it. You're making it into a whole new substance. You make it into something real. That's the error of reification. Whereas reification is the error of transubstantiation, tautology is the error of accepting a re-description as if it's an explanation. And we kind of looked at that just a little bit in some of the quotes. You can see how they advocated that reification and tautology go hand in hand. If you think that your diagnosis is something real existing in you, then you also naturally think that it explains your problems. So someone goes to the doctor concerning their son who's hyperactive and not paying attention, and they're asked of the doctor, what is wrong with my son? And the doctor says he has ADHD. And that father goes away and says to the person who asked him, hey, did you find out why your son is misbehaving, why he is hyperactive, why he can't concentrate, why he never finishes the tasks that are put before him, why he's always late and procrastinates and distracted? And he says to them, yes, I found out why. He has ADHD, or he is ADHD. That is the error of tautology. So if I believe that ADHD is a real thing, if I believe that bipolar is a real thing, the error is to then think that that explains my struggles, and they go hand in hand. Tautology and reification go hand in hand. Now, as I've stated before, psychiatric constructs are just re-descriptions of the descriptions. The person in trouble, the person struggling, or their family and friends are the ones that give the details to the physician, to the clinician that is assessing them. Even the clinicians don't discover these phenomena. They're simply given a list of descriptions or the phenomena that are being in question, they are pursuing help for, and the physician just re-describes that. So for example, I've mentioned ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. All the parent got was a re-description of why they came to the clinic in the first place. They wanted to know why their son was having attentional problems and was hyperactive and wasn't doing the things that functioning, quote unquote, as he would hoped or as that father expected the son to function. He wasn't meeting the objectives. And we'll talk again about objectivism, that philosophy that we looked at several videos ago. So if you think about this a second, all they're doing is re-describing the description. It is redundancy. This is the error. A description cannot explain. It can only describe. And so if you just give another description for a description, you are not at all explaining, you are just re-describing. Sadly, people think of this falsely as an explanation. So if you think that a psychiatric diagnosis explains why you're struggling, that is the error of tautology. One of the most influential psychiatrists of our time, Dr. Alan Francis, he actually chaired Duke University Psychiatry, as well as the DSM-4, the 4th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the Psychiatric Bible or Dictionary, as it is called. Both of those are ways that it is described. Listen to what he says in Frontiers in Psychiatry. It is fair to say that throughout its history, psychiatric diagnoses has always been overrated, purporting to explain what could only describe and maintaining only an incomplete relationship with treatment choice and response. It is fair to say that throughout its history, psychiatric diagnosis has always been overrated, purporting to explain what could only describe. That is really, really important. That is saying, hey, don't buy into the error of tautology. Here's another one in Medical Hypotheses by Tommy Bergerstrom. Since most of the psychiatric diagnoses do not actually take a stand regarding the cause of symptoms and were not developed for that purpose, reification of psychiatric diagnoses may lead to a circular logic, where symptoms and problems are narrated as being caused by those very same symptoms. This makes it even more challenging to address the factors that are causing human suffering in given situations. So again, if you accept the error of reification, that your diagnoses, the psychiatric diagnoses, are real things that exist in your body, you're very likely to accept this second error of tautology, a tautological error. If it's real, then it must explain why you're struggling in the way that you are. And both of these are errors, and you can see how they're wed together. So let me do it this way. If I were to walk in and see that my coffee cup was spilled all over the floor, and I asked my 4 children, how did the coffee spill? And one of them replied to me, the coffee spilled because of spilled coffee. We would not accept that answer because I'm just simply describing the very description that I'm trying to seek answers for. And yet this is precisely what psychiatry does. It just redescribes the known problem, and we're accepting it in error as if that explains the actual problem. Highly respected psychiatrist Sammy Tamimi, who is a pediatric psychiatrist in Europe, has this to say. In most of the rest of medicine, therefore, my diagnosis explains and has some causal connection with the patient's experienced symptoms. Thus, diagnosis sits in a technical explanatory classification framework. The problem with using a classification like depression to explain an experience can be illustrated by asking another set of questions. If I was asked why someone is feeling low and I answered that this is because they have depression, then a legitimate question to ask is, how do you know that this feeling low is caused by depression? The only answer I can give to that question is that I know it is depression because they are feeling low. In other words, if we try to use a classification that can only describe in order to explain, we end up with what philosophically is known as a tautology. A tautology is a circular thinking trap. A description cannot explain itself. Low mood and depression are synonymous. You cannot use one to explain the other. It's troubling when doctors use a descriptive category like depression to explain and cannot see this problem of tautological circularity. Using depression to explain low mood is like saying the pain in my head is caused by a headache or my cough is caused by coughing disorder. In psychiatry, therefore, what we are calling diagnosis will only describe, but it is unable to explain. If you think that depression explains your low mood, your incredibly sorrowful state, your despair, the crushed spirit, as Scripture calls it, and one of the ways Scripture calls it, then you have committed the error of tautology, as Sammy Tamimi points out. Redescriptions of descriptions cannot explain. A spilled coffee cup cannot be explained by a spilled coffee cup. Sadly, we as Christians have accepted this error, and people will tell you the reason why they're feeling a certain way, the reason why they're in a delusional state, the reason why they are in a manic state, the reason why they are in an anxious state is some type of construct that only redescribes their problem. It does not in any way explain their problem. The moment we think it explains our problem, as I've stated, that is a tautological error. We've committed the error of tautology. I've cited this trade journal article when I talked about reification, but these psychiatrists writing in Frontiers in Psychiatry also point out this error of tautology. They write, another common logical fallacy that can reify ADHD is circular argumentation. For example, Biederman and Ferrone state ADHD affects 8 to 12% of children worldwide and results in inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. In the order that the authors describe, it seems as if a discrete medical entity, ADHD, results in symptoms. In fact, children who display these behaviors can be classified with ADHD because these are the very behaviors that are used to define the disorder. It is circular to suggest that the name for these behaviors is the cause of these behaviors. That's the tautological error. Such circularity reifies ADHD by suggesting that it is a discrete brain disorder that causes certain unwanted behaviors rather than a construct that is used to name the behaviors. In other words, if you accept that your diagnosis is an explanation or is a valid cause, it forces you to reify the construct as the explanation. You can't hold that it's something different. Instead of just being a re-description, you view it as an explanation. So as I pointed out, these errors go hand in hand. Once you start accepting one or two of them, really you can't help but accept all of them at some point. Typically, it happens immediately. You think you have a real thing that is in you, that explains you, that is the cause of your problems. And this is how they deceive so many. Again, we could go on and on about this. There's so much literature on the error of tautology, or sometimes it's called the tautological error. But let's move on to the error of causality, or as it's sometimes called, causism. The error of causality. If this is not a real thing, can schizophrenia cause these psychotic breaks? Can bipolar cause someone to be in mania and depression? Can ADHD cause someone to be hyperactive and not be able to pay attention as we hope? That is the problem of causality. If you accept or believe that psychiatric diagnoses are real things existing in your body, then you also have to accept that they are explanatory, and explanation equals causation. If something explains my situation, then it likely causes it as well. Returning to the coffee illustration, if I ask, how did my coffee get spilled? And one of them says, by spilled coffee, then I'm not going to accept that as the cause. I'm looking for an explanation. I'm looking for a cause. However, if one of them says, I accidentally bumped into it and I spilled it everywhere, that is different than the description, than the question that I am asking, the description that I'm seeking answers for. And this is the problem that reification and tautology bring us to, the error of causality. Now, a good way to introduce or to explain the error of causality is to share with you a sign that I recently saw in a local donut shop. And it basically said this: in the span of 11 years, 150 people died in weightlifting accidents. In that same time period, only one person died eating a donut. Make the safe choice. Now, this is humorous. However, the error that occurs here is to take statistical information and deduce something that is not accurate. It's to suggest that donuts are healthy because only one person died while they were eating the donut. And of course, that excludes a lot of important information that can occur outside of the specific act of eating a donut, as well as the benefits of weightlifting. Certainly, weightlifting itself can be dangerous, but there are health benefits to being healthy. And we can see how the error of causality here is implied. It's not actually said, it's just simply implied. And this is the danger that regularly occurs when we take things that correlate or statistics and we try to deduce causality when none exists. So there's two ways in which the error of causality plays out. First of all, re-descriptions are not valid causes. I mentioned this a little bit in the tautological argument, but I want to key in on this a little bit more. Simply re-describing does not ever act as a cause, just like it cannot explain. And this is a common way in which the error of causality occurs. Respected neuropsychologist Jonathan Shedler says this in Psychology Today: psychiatric diagnoses are categorically different because they are merely descriptive, not explanatory. They sound like medical diseases, especially with ominously appended disorder, but they aren't. So let's return to the illustration of schizophrenia and considering the error of causality. Does schizophrenia cause psychosis or a split mind? Well, the very name split mind or schizophrenia is the same thing. So psychosis cannot cause psychosis, even if you rename psychosis to be a split mind. I want to cite from a very fascinating article called Mary Had Schizophrenia, Then Suddenly She Didn't, that was published in the New Yorker just a couple months ago, about a story of someone diagnosed for years and put into the psychiatric system, deep into the psychiatric system, diagnosed as schizophrenic, but then it was found out that she actually had a valid immune problem that they discovered accidentally, and all of her quote-unquote schizophrenia symptoms went away. And this is a case in point of how these are failures to explain. Schizophrenia is just a failure to explain when they don't know why someone is in psychotic breaks, persistent and chronic psychosis. But I want you to understand, schizophrenia comes from a eugenicist named Eugen Bleuler. It was first theorized by the other eugenicist I mentioned before, Emil Kraepelin. But listen to what this article states about Eugen Bleuler. In 1911, the psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler described how schizophrenic patients are capable of a kind of double booking. They may simultaneously live in two disjoint worlds, one grounded in shared reality, the other in private delusions. The idea of split mind simply means that a person is in truth in some regard, but they're also delusional or hallucinating. That's what psychosis means. It means that there's delusions, persistent and severe delusions and hallucinations that a person is struggling with. That's the idea, the phenomena of psychosis. And so the title just re-describes what was already known. When someone's in a psychotic break and you put the label schizophrenia on them, you're just simply re-describing what was already known. You're just saying, we don't know what the cause is, so let's call it schizophrenia. But listen to this article published in Schizophrenia Research by 3 of the world's leading experts on the construct of schizophrenia. They state this: the word diagnosis derives from the Greek for discern or distinguish, indicating that when we make a diagnosis, we discern what is present in the patient and we distinguish what sets them apart from other causes of their symptoms and or from healthy people. So let me pause and say this. If we're going to call psychiatric constructs psychiatric diagnoses, or I got a diagnosis, then we are saying we know what the cause is. The error of causality occurs as soon as a diagnosis is given. If it's called a diagnosis, if a person perceives that they're actually being diagnosed, that in itself is the error of causality. There's actually unknown, and many of the psychiatric constructs are simply a confession that the cause is unknown. In fact, all of the psychiatric constructs that are invented, that are created, that are fabricated, are confessions that the true cause of why that person is struggling is unknown. And so the word diagnosis is not a good word. It lends and actually promotes this error of causality. It implies that a cause has been found, and then whatever label has been put on that person's problems is the cause. Now, continuing on in this quote, a diagnostic term ideally indicates what is not functioning and discerns the underlying cause. For example, aplastic anemia versus sickle cell anemia versus iron deficiency anemia. The word schizophrenia, split mind, neither indicates what is malfunctioning nor discerns the cause of that malfunction from other potential causes. Nothing in modern science indicates that the mind or the brain are split into pieces when an individual meets diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia. Worse, the term has gained a pejorative and error-prone set of associations in the public mind, and it is almost impossible to use the diagnosis with a patient, family member, or healthcare provider without creating a cloud of nihilism. So hopelessness goes right along with this derived eugenic term. And it actually doesn't even describe the real problems. There's nothing in the brain or the mind that is split. It's just simply trying to rename psychosis. It's a fancy name for psychosis of unknown cause. And that's exactly what it is. It's not a cause itself. Let me say it this way. Psychosis cannot be the symptom or the fruit of something and the cause of that something that produces the cause that has an unknown cause. That's exactly what they're saying with schizophrenia. If you understand schizophrenia to be a psychosis, a severe and recurring psychosis of unknown cause, that's all this is. It is a play on words. It is a deceitful way to pretend like we know what a person has, when in fact we have no idea what they have, and we're just simply giving them major tranquilizers to try to get them back to sleep. And I'm not opposed to that. Please understand that. I'm just wanting you to understand the truth behind this. It's an error of causality to believe that these constructs are quote-unquote diagnoses. Dr. Chris Palmer, who is a teaching psychiatrist at Harvard and oversees a department there at McLean University, the teaching university for Harvard, has this to say about schizophrenia. One of the most frustrating and overlooked problems in psychiatry is the way diagnostic labels are too often mistaken for causes. It's a subtle but profound error that shapes the entire field. Take these common examples. She has hallucinations because she's a schizophrenic. He can't sit still because he has ADHD. It sounds reasonable, even scientific, but it's backward. In reality, a person is diagnosed with schizophrenia because they have hallucinations and often other symptoms of unknown cause. A person is diagnosed with ADHD because they can't sit still. If we knew the cause, say a viral infection, autoimmune condition, vitamin deficiency, or substance exposure, we call it something else, something treatable. The tragedy is that once the label is applied, the search for the cause often stops. The diagnosis becomes the explanation. Treatments focus on symptom management, often through medication, and we quietly accept that the person may never fully recover. Many mental health conditions are considered lifelong conditions, but this assumption robs people of hope and the possibility of healing. The truth is that symptoms always have causes. The question is whether we're willing to look for them. When you accept psychiatric quote-unquote diagnoses, constructs, as if they're explanatory, as if they're real, as if they're the cause, you will stop looking for valid causes. And in the case of the New Yorker article, Mary, they found valid causes. How much better would her life have been if she didn't go years and years and years within the psychiatric system and experience in her own testimony horrific experiences, traumatic experiences within the psychiatric system. And I'm not trying to be critical of them. I just simply want to point out that it is not something that is medical and loving to put a pseudo label, a pseudo explanation on people's very real problems. It actually impedes and hinders them from finding real causes to their real problems. As you note, Chris Palmer highlights, schizophrenia is simply psychosis of unknown cause. Psychiatric labels become very convenient because humanists don't believe in the spiritual nature and don't know how to approach the human nature, let alone to remedy the soul and its phenomena. And so we need to be very careful that we're not committing the error of reification, the error of tautology, and the error of causality. Again, these go hand in hand. They're distinctly different, but they overlap in many ways. And once you accept one, you begin to accept all of these errors, whether you want to or not. The second way in which the error of causality often occurs is in the correlations, whether it's with the body and the construct, alleged construct, thinking the construct is real, and then using statistics and measurements from the body of those labeled, those categorized within that label, or just correlating phenomena with other phenomena, anxiety with depression, or even constructs with constructs, ADHD with schizophrenia. These are errors of causation or causism. And so let's look a little bit at this before we move on to the next error. Since we've been discussing schizophrenia, I want to stick with that construct in our discussion today. If you look at global studies, take for example global genome studies looking at specific genes of those classified, those said to be schizophrenic. The first problem is that all the people that are labeled as schizophrenic are put into that category because of different events in their life, different underlying biological or spiritual problems that have led to sleep disruption or drug use that is involved. And so there's not one particular thing that somebody can say is a symptom of schizophrenia, nor a biological correlate to what is being called schizophrenia. And that includes genetic evidence. Of course, they call these risk factors now. So, for example, the MTHFR polymorphism, the two specific types of mutation that cause sleep disruption are found in construct of ADHD, they're found in the construct of bipolar, they're found in the construct of depression, of anxiety, and schizophrenia, to name a few. And secularists don't know how to explain, how are these all correlated? Why is this all together? And so they're correlating constructs with constructs. And this is where this error comes into play. The theory then comes that all mental illness must be related, at least these 6 different constructs, because one particular gene or many genes are implicated. They're correlating between these different constructs. Number one, the constructs don't exist as physical. So you can see how there's a presupposition there. If schizophrenia is real in the body, then it can be studied in comparison with the genome. And that's another problem that these researchers are faced with. There is no schizophrenia. So some people, as we saw with Mary in that article, were diagnosed because they have an immune problem that has not been discovered. And once it's found and all of their psychotic symptoms go away, they're not called schizophrenia anymore. But if the research is accumulated while they're in that system, which is the majority, then the information gathered is inaccurate. But as I pointed out, there are countless, as some articles say, legion of different causes to psychosis. And so they're really gathering information of people classified, people categorized, but that gives us no knowledge at all on causes. Even though these correlations are accumulated, they're not accurate correlations because, again, schizophrenia doesn't exist as a real thing. It has not been found in nature, and it is a failure to know what is actually causing psychosis, not an actual valid explanation. And so the correlations really don't matter with the construct, and yet that's what we're told. It's got to be a genetic risk because it correlates to someone being diagnosed as schizophrenic. That is very poor science, and that is part of the error of causality. Genetic risk is really a new way, a new narrative to try to sell the genetic theory without completely admitting that they have found no genetic link. Now, they have come out and said that. I want to make that clear. The problem with that as well is that in 2022 in the Schizophrenia Research Journal, many of the leading geneticists admitted that within the general population, these alleged risk factors for schizophrenia exist in almost everybody. It's a very common thing. And so not just people that end up into the diagnostic categories that they have devised. And so this is a very, very deceitful thing that makes us think that somehow there is a physical component to schizophrenia, which then tells us that a lie that schizophrenia is a real thing. It's a physical disease. And that is the farthest thing from the truth. Again, it's just a hypothesis about something real called psychosis. Likely you've heard that correlations do not equal causation. And that is precisely this error, this aspect of the error of causality that we are now talking about. Phenomena, again, cannot be subjected to the scientific process. And so if you put a label on the phenomena, if I can say it in their terms, if you take the symptoms, they're just phenomena, and you put them into a syndrome, then you can study the body of those that are put into this syndrome or labeled with this syndrome, and you can say that there are correlations between them that justify the syndrome rather than actually showing that there's correlations with the phenomena. The body and the soul, let me make clear, always correspond. Every thought that we have, every emotion that we have, every behavior that we have is going to correspond in the body at some point. It has to. This is how God has designed it. This is our tent. This is our jar of clay, as 2 Corinthians 3 through 5 tell us. God made our spiritual and physical to correlate together. So we should expect there to be correlations between the metaphysical and the physical. That does not justify psychiatric constructs, and that is part of this error. Taking correlations of the spiritual nature and the physical nature and saying that it justifies this third-party creation, this heuristic construct, this psychiatric quote-unquote diagnoses, is an error of causality. The body and the immaterial that God has made in his image will always correlate because that's God's design. But that does not prove psychiatric labels. But to further complicate things, despite not knowing what causes schizophrenia, openly admitting that it doesn't exist as a real thing, many people still theorize that it is a quote-unquote brain disorder or a brain disease. For example, listen to the Mayo Clinic that is accessible by the general population. They state, "It isn't known what causes schizophrenia, but researchers believe that a mix of genetics, brain chemistry, and environment can play a part. Changes in certain naturally occurring brain chemicals, including neurotransmitters called dopamine and glutamine, may play a part in schizophrenia. Neuroimaging studies show changes in the brain structure and central nervous system of people with schizophrenia." While researchers haven't yet been able to apply these findings to new treatments, the findings show that schizophrenia is a brain disease. Now, it's almost comical here. They're openly admitting in the first sentence that they don't know what causes schizophrenia, but because there's correlations between psychosis and the body, they're insisting that it must be then a brain disease. In other words, you're led to believe that the brain is causing what we would call schizophrenia, or that schizophrenia is a real thing existing in the brain, or that schizophrenia has affected the brain, or the brain produces schizophrenia, that it is a quote-unquote real thing, that it explains the psychosis, that it is caused by something in the body. This is the error of causality. To openly admit in that first sentence, as you can see here, it isn't known what causes schizophrenia, but researchers believe that a mix of genetics, brain chemistry, and environment can play a part. So we don't know what causes it, but we're going to tell you what causes it in theory. And we want you to accept it as if that is true. That is the error of causality. Apart from real empirical evidence, they're going to take correlations of the metaphysical nature and the physical nature and say this applies to our third-party creation, these constructs. Listen to what psychiatrist Gerald Young says in Frontiers in Psychiatry. Causality, or etiology, in psychiatry is marked by standard biomedical reductionistic models. Symptoms reflect the construct involved that inform approaches to nostalgia or classification, such as in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. So clearly, reductionism, bioreductionism, is at the root of this entire error of causality. They have to reduce everything to some type of physical explanation. And if they can find any marker in the body, any significant correlate, then they're going to apply that to the construct that does not exist itself as a physical thing. It is not real. It is a contrived hypothesis. It is not something that has been found in nature. That's an error of causation or causism. Similarly, Jonathan Shedler shares this perspective. DSM diagnoses are categorically different because they are merely descriptive, never explanatory. It's not that we don't know their cause yet, it's that the DSM diagnoses cannot speak to cause, now or ever. The DSM was not designed to address causes, only to describe effects. Most psychiatrists subscribe to a biopsychosocial model, which means they see the causes of mental health problems as biological, psychological, social, or an interaction between them. But the DSM is not organized by these domains. It does not address them, nor attempt to. DSM diagnoses are merely descriptive, not explanatory. So we will never find causes for these contrived constructs, and that's simply what he's pointing out here. It was not designed to do that. I will also note that the biopsychosocial model, as I have in other videos, sounds really good. We would actually hold to a theobiopsychosocial model. The problem is that they reduce relationships or social interactions. They reduce the psyche or the mind, the soul, down to biology. And so it's really the bio model. Dr. Kenneth Kindler quoted the famous psychiatrist Carl Jaspers in Molecular Psychiatry. Listen to what he states here. The still widespread somatic prejudice is everything mental cannot be examined as such, it is merely subjective. If it is to be discussed scientifically, it must be presented anatomically, physically, as a physical function. For this is For this, it is better to have a preliminary anatomical structure, which is considered heuristic, than a direct psychological investigation. Such anatomical constructions are quite fantastic and are rightly called brain mythologies, things that have no connection to one another, such as cortical cells and memory images, brain fibers, and psychological associations are brought together. There is also no basis for these mythologies insofar as not a single specific brain process is known that could be assigned to a specific mental process as a direct parallel phenomena. I will likely return to this quote when we talk about the last error, the error of category or the categorical error, because he points out that there's connections made that cannot happen. And I'll save that for that discussion. But notice what he says here. There is also no basis for these mythologies, and as so far as not a single specific brain process is known that could be assigned to a specific mental process as a direct parallel. And that is still true today. We can't find delusions in the brains or anxiety in the brain. We can certainly see how the brain is involved and where a thought first appears in the body. That is true. But saying that the brain caused that thought is an impossibility. We don't know which came first. In fact, all the available science shows the exact opposite. If you want an interesting study neurosurgeon Michael Egner. He has a fascinating study on this very thing, that the available evidence, as far as we can get back to studying the mind and the brain, shows that the mind actually produces the effects in the brain versus what secularists, what humanists have tried to advocate, that the brain produces the mind. It creates the mind is what they advocate. So what they've done, as Jasper has pointed out, is they've created these heuristic constructs, and he uses that word again there, these fantastic anatomical constructs. They don't know how to study anxiety. They don't know how to study depression. They don't know how to study delusions inside the body anywhere. They can't find it, let alone the soul. And so they create these medically sounding constructs, these heuristics, these fantastic heuristics to try to do science with and research. And really, I think it's partly to sell that they are medical issues and to sell that they are the experts on the soul, that they can do soul care within medicine. It is a deceitful thing that we have accepted. But listen to the former director of the National Institutes of Mental Health, Thomas Insel. When he talks about schizophrenia, he describes it as a syndrome. In other words, a construct based on the phenomena, the grouped together phenomena. Again, the phenomena are real, but the syndrome is just created to try to explain all these phenomena. He states, schizophrenia is a syndrome, a collection of signs and symptoms of unknown etiology, predominantly defined by observed signs of psychosis. So you notice that schizophrenia is simply a syndrome, and as Insel points out, that just simply means a collection of signs and symptoms. In other words, let's take symptoms, real phenomena, let's use the accurate terminology, it's just phenomena. It's things that are occurring, distresses and struggles in your soul. They call those symptoms. And that's a convenient twist as well, because if you have symptoms, then you can make a syndrome, and the syndrome sounds like it is something. But in reality, let's read what he says again in the middle. A collection of signs and symptoms of unknown etiology or unknown cause. They don't know what the cause is. But what's the predominant definition of it? It is the signs of psychosis. All they're doing is saying, we don't know what is causing psychosis, so let's call it schizophrenia, because psychosis is real. As we pointed out, psychosis is real, but we don't know what's causing it, so let's just call it schizophrenia. I've made it very clear in past videos as well that when we know what is causing psychosis, like drug-induced psychosis or neuroencephalitis-induced or Lyme's disease or traumatic brain injuries, on and on it goes, we don't label it as schizophrenia because we know the cause. All this label does is deceive many into thinking that schizophrenia is a real thing, that it explains their psychosis, that it is something that exists. But the reality is you can't have something as a symptom and as a cause at the same time that has an unknown cause. It is a logical fallacy, and yet that is what is being promoted. I want to return to Dr. Alan Francis as he describes schizophrenia in light of this truth. He states schizophrenia is a useful construct, not myth, not disease. It is a description of a particular set of psychiatric problems, again, primarily psychosis, as we saw from Thomas Insel, not an explanation of their cause. We can't say that schizophrenia causes psychosis. It's just a useful or heuristic construct. It is not a disease. That's really important because if you say it's a disease, you are reifying the construct. You are taking a devised, a fabricated, quote unquote, scientific tool, that's how they describe it, to do research, to file insurance claims, to have a dialogue, a language for clinicians to talk. It doesn't really exist in the real world. It's a insider's code, if you would, for psychosis of unknown cause, and yet so many people commit these errors of reification, of causation, and of tautology. I hope that today's discussion on these two errors have been helpful. And in the next video, we'll look at the last two errors and tie all of this together. I hope you'll come back for that video.